The laugh echoed through the courtroom like a slap. Gerald Whitmore, my husband's attorney, actually threw his head back and laughed. Not a polite chuckle or a suppressed snicker. A full theatrical, look at this pathetic woman laugh that bounced off the wood-paneled walls and settled into my bones like ice. Your Honor, he said, still grinning, Mrs. Patterson is claiming she's entitled to half of my client's construction empire. An empire she had absolutely nothing to do with building. She was a housewife. She made casseroles and drove carpools. With all due respect to casseroles, that doesn't entitle someone to $50 million. The gallery behind me rippled with uncomfortable murmurs. I could feel my sister's outrage radiating from her seat 3 rows back. I could sense my attorney, a young woman named Priya Sharma who had taken my case when no one else would, tensing beside me. And I could see my husband Richard, sitting at the opposing table with that satisfied smirk he always wore when he thought he was winning. He thought he was winning. They all did. Gerald Whitmore had been practicing law for 32 years. He'd never lost a divorce case involving significant assets. He charged $800 an hour and was worth every penny to the wealthy men who hired him to protect their fortunes from the women they were discarding. I was supposed to be intimidated. I was supposed to crumble under the weight of his reputation and his ridicule. I was supposed to accept whatever scraps Richard deigned to throw my way and be grateful for them. But here's the thing about being underestimated for 23 years of marriage. You learn to wait. You learn to watch. You learn to gather ammunition so quietly that no one notices you are armed until it is far too late. Gerald was still chuckling, shuffling his papers with the casual confidence of a man who had already won. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Hayes, was looking at me with something that might have been pity. Even Priya seemed uncertain, her hand hovering over her legal pad like she was trying to figure out how to recover from this public humiliation. And then the courtroom doors opened. Every head turned. Gerald's laughter died in his throat. Richard's smirk froze and then shattered. And I, for the first time in 3 years, allowed myself to smile. Because walking through those doors was the one person who could prove everything. The one witness Gerald hadn't prepared for because he didn't know she existed. The one woman who had been hiding in plain sight for 2 decades, watching Richard build his empire on a foundation of lies. His first wife. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning. Because you need to understand how a woman everyone dismissed as just a housewife managed to orchestrate the most devastating courtroom surprise in the history of this county's family court. You need to understand how I went from making casseroles to making Gerald Whitmore choke on his own arrogance. My name is Catherine Patterson. I'm 47 years old, and until 6 months ago, I was married to Richard Patterson, founder and CEO of Patterson Construction, one of the largest commercial builders in the southeastern United States. 23 years of marriage, 3 children, a beautiful home in a gated community. The kind of life that looks perfect in Christmas card photos and crumbles to dust the moment you look too closely. I met Richard when I was 22 years old, fresh out of college with a degree in accounting and absolutely no idea what I wanted to do with my life. I was working as a bookkeeper at a small firm in Charlotte, handling accounts for local businesses, learning the rhythms of numbers and balance sheets. Richard was one of our clients, a young contractor with a pickup truck and a dream. He wasn't rich then, far from it. He was scraping together every job he could find, underbidding competitors, working 16-hour days to build something from nothing. He was hungry in a way that was almost contagious. When he talked about the future, you believed him. When he said he was going to build an empire, you didn't laugh. You wanted to help him do it. I fell in love with that hungry young man. Or maybe I fell in love with the idea of building something together. Either way, when he asked me to marry him after 8 months of dating, I said yes without hesitation. My mother thought I was crazy. He doesn't have 2 nickels to rub together, she said. You could do so much better. But I was 23 and in love and convinced that potential was more valuable than security. I was going to stand beside this man and help him build his dreams, and we were going to do it together. The wedding was small, City Hall, lunch at a diner afterward, a one-night honeymoon at a motel by the beach. We couldn't afford more, but Richard held my hand that night and promised me that someday, he would give me everything. The house, the cars, the life I deserved. All I had to do was trust him. So I trusted him. For 23 years, I trusted him. The early years were hard but happy. I quit my bookkeeping job to help Richard full-time because he couldn't afford to hire anyone else. I did his books, managed his accounts, handled his invoicing, chase down payments from clients who were slow to pay. I learned every aspect of his business because there was no one else to learn it. When Richard landed his first major contract, a small strip mall that would change everything, I stayed up for 3 nights straight helping him prepare the bid. When he won it, we celebrated with cheap champagne and cried in each other's arms. When the project ran over budget and threatened to bankrupt us, I found the accounting error that saved us, a subcontractor who had been double billing. When the mall opened on time and under budget, Richard got the credit. I got a kiss on the cheek and a thank you. That became the pattern. Richard built. I supported. Richard succeeded. I applauded. Richard received recognition, awards, magazine profiles, industry accolades. I stood beside him in photographs, smiling, wearing dresses he picked out, playing the role of the supportive wife who had contributed nothing except moral support. But I knew the truth. For the first decade of Patterson construction, I was the back office. I was the one who kept the books balanced, who caught the errors, who made sure the numbers added up. When Richard was out schmoozing clients and closing deals, I was at home with spreadsheets and invoices, building the financial foundation that allowed his dreams to become reality. Then the children came. Michael first, then Sarah, then little James. 3 pregnancies, 3 years of nursing, years of diapers and sleepless nights, and the gradual surrender of my professional identity. Richard hired a real bookkeeper, then an accountant, then a CFO. My contributions were no longer needed. I was transitioned into a new role: mother, homemaker, the woman behind the man. I don't regret my children. They are the best things I've ever done. But I do regret losing myself in the process. I do regret becoming invisible in my own life. I do regret 23 years of trust in a man who didn't deserve it. The change in Richard was gradual. So gradual I didn't notice it happening until it was already complete. The hungry young contractor who had promised me everything slowly became a wealthy CEO who gave me nothing. Not nothing material. I had the house and the cars and the credit cards, but nothing real. No partnership, no respect, no acknowledgement that I had helped build the very empire he was now using to dismiss me. He started coming home later, started taking business trips that stretched longer and longer, started looking at me like I was furniture, something useful but not particularly interesting. The man who had once held my hand and cried over champagne now barely remembered to acknowledge my presence at his own dinner parties. I told myself it was stress. I told myself successful men were often distracted. I told myself that after the children were grown, things would go back to normal. I told myself 1,000 lies because the truth was too painful to face. The truth found me anyway. It always does. I discovered the affair on a Tuesday afternoon. Such an ordinary day for such an extraordinary betrayal. I was cleaning Richard's home office, something I rarely did because he was territorial about his space. But the cleaning lady was sick, and I needed to find a receipt for a charitable donation for our taxes. And I thought, what harm could it do? The harm was considerable. I found photographs first. Richard and a woman I didn't recognize, a blonde in her 30s with the kind of figure that comes from personal trainers and plastic surgeons. They were on a yacht I'd never seen, in locations I'd never visited, wearing matching expressions of intimate happiness that I hadn't seen on Richard's face in years. Then I found the credit card statements, a separate card I knew nothing about, with charges for jewelry I'd never received, hotels I'd never stayed at, restaurants I'd never eaten at, tens of thousands of dollars in expenses that had nothing to do with me. Then I found the letter, a handwritten letter on expensive stationery, tucked into the pages of a book on his shelf. My darling, it began. I count the days until we can be together openly. When Catherine is finally out of the picture, when the children are grown and the timing is right, we will have everything we've dreamed of. Out of the picture. Like I was an obstacle to be removed. Like 23 years of marriage was just a holding pattern until something better came along. I sat on the floor of Richard's office for 2 hours, surrounded by the evidence of his betrayal, and I felt my entire life reframe itself around this new information. Every late night, every business trip, every distant look, every dismissive comment. It all made sense now. He hadn't been distracted by success. He'd been distracted by her. My first instinct was to confront him, to scream, to cry, to demand explanations. But something stopped me. Some survival instinct that had been dormant for years suddenly woke up and whispered, wait. So I waited. I put everything back exactly where I'd found it. I cleaned his office like I'd planned. I made dinner like nothing had happened. And I started to think, if you're enjoying this story, I need you to hit that subscribe button right now. Because what comes next is the part where I stopped being a victim and started being strategic. And I want you to be here for every moment of it. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and whether you have ever felt invisible in your own life. I read every single comment. Now, let's continue. Over the following weeks, I became a detective in my own marriage. Not dramatically, not obviously. I didn't follow Richard or hire a private investigator or confront his mistress. I simply started paying attention in ways I hadn't in years. I paid attention to his schedule, noting which business trips coincided with her social media posts from similar locations. I paid attention to his phone calls, catching fragments of conversations that made no sense if they were actually about construction contracts. I paid attention to his finances, using skills I hadn't employed in 15 years to trace the flow of money through accounts I wasn't supposed to know about. And I found something far more interesting than an affair. Richard Patterson, the self-made construction mogul, the man who claimed to have built everything from nothing, had a secret that went back further than his infidelity. A secret that predated our marriage entirely. A secret that explains so much about who he was and how he'd gotten where he was. Richard had been married before. Not a youthful indiscretion, not a brief starter marriage that ended amicably. A real marriage, to a woman named Sandra Chen, that had lasted 4 years and ended in a divorce so ugly it had been sealed by court order. I only found out because of a clerical error. An old document misfiled in a folder labeled insurance, a settlement agreement from 1995 that should have been destroyed years ago. Richard Patrick Patterson and Sandra Michelle Chen. Division of assets. Non-disclosure agreement. Permanent sealing of all court records pertaining to the dissolution. Why would anyone seal a divorce record? I wondered. What could possibly be so damaging that it needed to be hidden forever? I found Sandra. It wasn't easy. She had remarried, changed her name twice, moved across the country. But I found her because I was patient and methodical and had 23 years of bookkeeper's instincts that were finally being put to good use. Her name was Sandra Mitchell now. She lived in Portland, Oregon. She was 52 years old, worked as a librarian, and had remarried a kind man named Thomas who knew nothing about her first husband. She had built a quiet life far from Richard Patterson and everything he represented. I called her on a Wednesday evening, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. When she answered, I said the only thing I could think of. My name is Catherine Patterson. I'm married to your ex-husband, and I think I need your help. The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought she'd hung up. Then very quietly she said, I've been waiting for this call for 27 years. What Sandra told me over the following weeks changed everything I thought I knew about my husband and my marriage. Richard hadn't built his empire from nothing. He'd built it from her. Sandra Chen had been an architect, a brilliant young designer who had created the aesthetic and the vision that would become Patterson Construction's signature style. She had brought in the early clients, developed the relationships, designed the buildings that established Richard's reputation. And when the business started to succeed, Richard had systematically erased her from it. He had isolated her from their shared clients, telling them she was ill, that she was unstable, that she couldn't be trusted with important projects. He had transferred assets out of their joint accounts into companies she didn't know about. He had built a case for divorce that painted her as mentally unstable, using her depression, caused by his abuse, as evidence that she was unfit for anything. The settlement she'd received was a fraction of what she was owed. The non-disclosure agreement prevented her from ever telling her story. The sealed records ensured that no one would ever know what Richard had done to the woman who had actually built the foundation of his success. She had spent 2 years fighting him and lost everything. By the end, she was so broken she just wanted out. She signed whatever they put in front of her. She disappeared into a new life and tried to forget the man who had stolen her dreams and called them his own. Sound familiar? I asked her during one of our calls. Because it sounds exactly like what he's doing to me. History repeating itself, Sandra said. Richard doesn't see women as partners. He sees us as resources to be extracted and discarded. I was the architect. You were the bookkeeper. Whoever comes after you will be something else useful until she isn't. There's someone after me, I told her. A blonde named Jessica. She thinks she's going to be the next Mrs. Patterson. Sandra laughed, but there was no humor in it. She probably will be. And 10 years from now, she'll be exactly where you are, wondering what happened to her life and how she can get out. I'm getting out, I said, but I'm not going quietly, and I need your help. What do you need? I need you to testify. I need you to break your non-disclosure agreement and tell a judge exactly what Richard did to you. I need you to help me prove that Patterson Construction was never built by Richard alone, that there have always been women behind him, doing the real work, getting none of the credit. Sandra was quiet for a long moment. That agreement has teeth. If I break it, Richard could come after me, sue me, destroy what I've built here. I know, I said. I'm asking a lot, but I'm also offering something in return. What's that? Vindication. The chance to tell your story after 27 years. The chance to make sure he can't do to me what he did to you. The chance to finally make Richard Patterson face consequences. Another long pause. Then Sandra said something that surprised me. I've kept copies of everything. Every document, every contract, every piece of evidence that proves what I contributed. I've had them in a safety deposit box in Seattle for 27 years, waiting for exactly this moment. Why would you keep them if you couldn't use them? Because I always believed that someday, somehow, he would be held accountable, and I wanted to be ready. That was the moment I knew I was going to win. While Sandra and I prepared our case, I played the role of oblivious wife. Richard wanted a divorce? Fine. I'd give him a divorce. He wanted to portray me as a gold digger who contributed nothing. Fine. I'd act exactly like what he expected. I cried at the initial filings. I begged him to reconsider. I called his lawyer's office 3 times, hysterical, pathetic, exactly the kind of desperate housewife that Gerald Whitmore loved to destroy in court. I made myself small and weak and inconsequential. Richard barely looked at me during our separation. He'd already moved into a downtown condo with Jessica, already planning the life they would have once I was disposed of. He saw me as I'd been for years, furniture, useful once, but now just an obstacle. But I wasn't furniture anymore. I was a chess player, moving pieces into position for a game Richard didn't even know was being played. Priya Sharma, my attorney, was young and hungry and smart. She'd taken my case at a reduced rate because she believed in me when no one else did. The big firms had all turned me down. Too complicated, they said. Too risky. Gerald Whitmore has never lost a case like this. Priya looked at Gerald Whitmore's track record and said, everyone has to lose eventually. Why not now? I liked her immediately. We built our case carefully, layer by layer. My financial contributions during the early years, documented in records I'd kept copies of even after Richard hired professional accountants. Sandra's testimony about the founding of the company, corroborated by documents that had survived 27 years in a safety deposit box. The pattern of behavior, the systematic erasure of women's contributions, the gaslighting and manipulation that Richard used to maintain control. We also found Jessica. Not directly. We didn't approach her. But we found records of Richard's relationship with her, evidence that he'd been planning to leave me for years, that the affair predated our separation by at least 5 years, evidence that he'd been hiding assets in her name, transferring money and property to ensure it wouldn't be considered marital assets in the divorce. That was the mistake that would cost him everything, because hiding assets in a divorce is illegal, and Richard had hidden millions. The day of the hearing arrived. I dressed carefully, conservatively. A navy blue dress, modest jewelry, sensible heels. I looked like exactly what Gerald Whitmore expected, a middle-aged housewife who had let herself go, who had nothing to offer except tears and appeals to sympathy. Richard looked immaculate. Designer suit, expensive watch, the confidence of a man who had never been told no in his life. Jessica was in the gallery, trying to look supportive without looking too much like the mistress. Gerald Whitmore was shuffling his papers with the casual assurance of someone who already knew the outcome. And I sat at my table with Priya, hands folded, face neutral, waiting. The hearing began as expected. Gerald made his opening statement, painting Richard as a self-made man whose wife had contributed nothing but domesticity. He called me a housewife with delusions of partnership. He suggested I was mentally unstable, pointing to the crying phone calls I'd made to his office. He painted a picture of a desperate woman trying to steal money she had earned from a man who had built everything through his own hard work. That's when he laughed. When he made his casserole comment. When he looked at me like I was beneath contempt and expected the judge to share his disdain. Priya stood to respond. She was calm, measured, professional. Your Honor, Opposing counsel has painted a vivid picture of my client as a pathetic housewife who contributed nothing to Patterson Construction. I intend to prove that this picture is not only inaccurate but part of a deliberate pattern of behavior by Mr. Patterson, a pattern of erasing women's contributions, hiding assets, and manipulating the legal system. Gerald snorted. This should be entertaining. Priya smiled. Oh, it will be. She called me to the stand first. I testified about the early years, about my role as bookkeeper and accountant and office manager. I presented records I'd kept, invoices in my handwriting, contracts I'd negotiated, clients I'd brought in. I walked the court through year after year of unpaid labor that had built the foundation of Patterson Construction. Gerald cross-examined me with the smugness of a man who had done this 100 times before. Mrs. Patterson, isn't it true that you stopped working for the company when your children were born? I stopped working in the office. I corrected him. I continued working. I managed the household that allowed Richard to focus on the business. I raised 3 children who are now successful adults. I hosted countless dinner parties where Richard networked with clients. I was a full-time partner in his success, just not a visible one. But you weren't involved in the day-to-day operations after 2005. Not directly, but I was involved in the decision to hire the people who were. I was involved in reviewing financial statements. I was involved in every aspect of our shared life, which included the business that consumed most of Richard's time and attention. Gerald smiled, the patronizing smile of a man who thought he was winning. So your contribution was being a wife and mother. Admirable, but hardly the same as running a construction empire. I looked at him steadily. My contribution was being the invisible foundation that allowed the visible structure to exist. Without foundations, Mr. Whitmore, buildings collapse. Gerald waved his hand dismissively. Metaphors don't win divorces, Mrs. Patterson. No, I agreed. Evidence does. If you're still with me, hit that like button right now. Because the next part is where everything changed. And I want to know in the comments what you think is coming. Have you guessed who my witness was? Let me know. Then keep watching. Priya called her next witness. Sandra Mitchell, she announced. The courtroom doors opened, and Sandra walked in. She was 52 now, silver-haired and dignified, with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades making peace with her past. She walked up the center aisle, past Richard's stunned face, past Gerald's suddenly uncertain expression, and took her seat in the witness stand. Richard went pale, actually pale, like someone had drained the blood from his face. He turned to whisper frantically to Gerald, who was flipping through papers, looking for information about a witness he hadn't prepared for. Your Honor, Gerald interrupted. We weren't notified about this witness. Judge Hayes looked at Priya. Miss Sharma? Mrs. Mitchell was added to our witness list 72 hours ago, as required by court procedure. Opposing counsel received notification. Gerald checked his phone, scrolling through emails. His face tightened when he found what he was looking for. I see that now, Your Honor. But I need time to prepare cross-examination. Judge Hayes shook her head. You've had adequate notice, Mr. Whitmore. We'll proceed. Sandra took her oath and settled into the witness chair. She looked at Richard for a long moment, and something passed between them. Not anger, not hatred, something closer to resolution, like a wound that had finally been allowed to heal. Priya began. Mrs. Mitchell, can you state your relationship to Richard Patterson? Sandra's voice was steady. I was his first wife. We were married from 1991 to 1995. A murmur ran through the gallery. Richard's second wife. No one had known there was a first. Can you describe your involvement with Patterson Construction during your marriage? I co-founded the company with Richard in 1992. I was the head architect and designer. I brought in our first major clients through my connections in the design community. I created the aesthetic and the vision that became Patterson Construction's signature style. Gerald objected. Your Honor, these claims are unsubstantiated. We have no documentation of any of this. Actually, Priya said, producing a thick folder. We do. Sandra reached into her bag and pulled out an identical folder. I've kept copies of everything for 27 years. Contracts signed by both of us. Design documents in my handwriting. Client correspondence addressed to both partners. Bank statements showing deposits from clients I personally recruited. The folders were admitted as evidence. Gerald's face was getting redder by the minute. Mrs. Mitchell, Priya continued, can you describe how your marriage and business partnership ended? Sandra took a deep breath. Richard systematically isolated me from our shared clients. He told them I was mentally unstable, that I couldn't be trusted. He transferred assets out of our joint accounts without my knowledge. He built a case for divorce that painted me as unfit, using depression that he had caused through years of emotional abuse. Objection, Gerald interrupted. This is hearsay and character assassination. Your Honor, Priya responded. Mrs. Mitchell is testifying to her direct experience. She has documentation to support her claims, and her testimony is directly relevant to establishing a pattern of behavior by Mr. Patterson. Overruled, Judge Hayes said. Continue. Sandra continued. By the end of our marriage, I was so broken I just wanted out. I signed a settlement agreement that gave me a fraction of what I was owed. I signed a non-disclosure agreement that prevented me from ever telling my story. And I watched Richard take credit for everything I had built. She looked directly at Richard. I thought I would never get to tell the truth. I thought I would have to carry this secret forever. But here I am. And the truth is that Richard Patterson did not build his empire alone. He built it on the backs of women he used and discarded. First me, then Catherine, and whoever comes next. Gerald's cross-examination was brutal but ineffective. He attacked Sandra's credibility, her memory, her motives. He pointed out that she had signed a non-disclosure agreement and was now violating it. He suggested she was bitter, vengeful, motivated by jealousy of Richard's success. Sandra remained calm through all of it. Yes, she agreed. I signed a non-disclosure agreement. I signed it because I was broken and desperate and had nothing left to fight with. But that agreement was designed to protect Richard from the consequences of his own actions, not to serve any legitimate legal purpose. And I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences come from breaking it, because the truth matters more than my comfort. What truth? Gerald demanded. The truth that you were an unstable woman who couldn't handle the pressures of business. The truth that Richard built Patterson Construction through his own hard work while you contributed nothing but problems? Sandra smiled, and it was the saddest smile I'd ever seen. The truth, Mr. Whitmore, is that Richard Patterson is a user. He finds talented women, extracts their value, and throws them away when he's done. He did it to me. He's doing it to Catherine. And he'll do it to the blonde in the gallery if she's foolish enough to marry him. Jessica flinched. The gallery murmured. Gerald called for a recess. Judge Hayes granted 15 minutes. I walked out into the hallway with Priya, my heart pounding with adrenaline and hope. That went well, Priya said, understating things considerably. We're not done yet, I reminded her. We still have the financial evidence. She nodded. The hidden assets. That's our knockout punch. The recess ended. We returned to the courtroom, and Priya called her final witness, Margaret Chen, forensic accountant. Margaret was a small woman with glasses and a no-nonsense demeanor. She had spent 3 months analyzing Patterson Construction's finances, tracing money through shell companies and offshore accounts, documenting every hidden asset and fraudulent transfer. Her testimony was devastating. Over the past 5 years, she explained, Mr. Patterson has transferred approximately $12 million in assets to entities controlled by his girlfriend, Jessica Winters. These transfers were structured to avoid detection during divorce proceedings. They include real estate, investment accounts, and ownership stakes in subsidiary companies. Gerald objected constantly, but the documents spoke for themselves. Bank records, corporate filings, property deeds, a paper trail that led directly from Patterson Construction to Jessica's name, routed through shell companies designed to obscure the connection. In my professional opinion, Margaret concluded, Mr. Patterson has engaged in deliberate and systematic asset concealment. The transfers were made after the marriage began to deteriorate, with the clear intention of depriving Mrs. Patterson of her share of marital assets. Richard was no longer smirking. He was sweating, whispering urgently to Gerald, his composure crumbling in real time. Jessica had stopped looking supportive and started looking terrified. The gallery was riveted. Judge Hayes called for closing arguments. Gerald did his best, but his usual confidence was gone. He tried to discredit our witnesses, but the documentation was overwhelming. He tried to minimize Richard's asset transfers, but the numbers were too damning. He tried to salvage something, anything, from the wreckage of his case. Your Honor, he concluded weakly, my client is a successful businessman who made some poor personal choices. That doesn't entitle his wife to half his fortune. Priya stood for her closing. Your Honor, this case is about more than money. It's about a pattern of behavior that has destroyed the lives of at least 2 women. Richard Patterson built his empire on stolen contributions. He erased Sandra Chen's role in founding his company. He erased Catherine Patterson's role in running it during its early years. He hid $12 million to deprive his wife of her rightful share. And he did all of this while treating these women as invisible, disposable, beneath his notice. She paused, letting the words settle. Catherine Patterson is not asking for charity. She is asking for justice. She contributed to this marriage for 23 years. She raised 3 children while her husband built his business. She kept his home, supported his career, and gave up her own professional identity to serve his ambitions. And when he decided he was done with her, he expected her to disappear quietly, just like Sandra did. Priya looked at me, but Catherine didn't disappear. She found Sandra. She found the hidden assets. She found the truth that Richard has been hiding for decades. And now she is asking this court to recognize what she has always known, that she is not invisible, that she is not disposable, and that she deserves half of everything she helped build. Judge Hayes took the case under advisement. She would issue her ruling in 1 week. The week was the longest of my life. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything except the waiting. Priya assured me that the evidence was overwhelming, but I'd seen too much of Richard's ability to escape consequences to feel confident. Sandra called every day to check in. She was worried about the non-disclosure violation, about the possibility that Richard would sue her into oblivion. But she also seemed lighter somehow, like testifying had lifted a weight she'd been carrying for nearly 3 decades. "Thank you," she told me. "Whatever happens, thank you for giving me the chance to tell the truth." "I should be thanking you," I said. "You saved my case." "We saved each other," she corrected. "That's what women do when men try to break us. We find each other and we fight back." The ruling came on a Friday afternoon. Priya called me with the news, and I could hear the smile in her voice before she said a word. We won, not just won, demolished. Judge Hayes found in my favor on every significant point. She accepted Sandra's testimony as evidence of a pattern of behavior. She found that Richard had engaged in deliberate asset concealment. She determined that I had made substantial contributions to the marriage and the business, even if those contributions were not always visible or compensated. The financial award was staggering. 60% of all marital assets, including the hidden $12 million, the house, retirement accounts, stock in Patterson Construction, alimony that would continue until I remarried or Richard died. The total came to over $30 million. But the money wasn't the best part. The best part was the judge's closing statement, quoted in the local paper the next day. "This court has heard testimony about a man who built his success by erasing women's contributions. A man who used, discarded, and silenced the partners who helped him achieve everything he has. This pattern of behavior is not just unethical, it is actionable, and this court will not allow it to continue." Gerald Whitmore's perfect record was broken. Richard Patterson's reputation was destroyed. Jessica Winters quietly moved out of the downtown condo and was never seen with Richard again. And I walked out of that courtroom a free woman, a wealthy woman, a woman who had spent 23 years invisible and was finally seen. The aftermath was complicated, as aftermath always is. Richard appealed, lost, and appealed again. The legal battle dragged on for another year, but the outcome never seriously changed. The evidence was too overwhelming, the pattern to clear. Gerald Whitmore retired 6 months after the case. I heard he told colleagues that he was tired, that he wanted to spend more time with his grandchildren. But I also heard that losing to a housewife had damaged his reputation in ways he couldn't recover from. The man who laughed at casseroles was now the man who got beaten by them. Sandra and I became friends, real friends, not just allies of convenience. She came to visit me in my new house, the one I bought with my settlement money, and we drank wine on my porch and talked about the years we lost to Richard E.'s manipulation. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked her once. "Speaking up after all those years? Breaking the agreement?" "Never," she said. "Not for 1 second. The agreement was designed to protect Richard's lies. Breaking it was the most honest thing I've done in decades. And the consequences? Richard threatened to sue," she admitted. But his lawyers told him it would only draw more attention to everything he'd done. So he dropped it. "I think he just wants to pretend none of this ever happened." She laughed. "Which is exactly what he wanted me to do. Pretend, forget, disappear. Instead, I became a witness for the prosecution. Best revenge I could have asked for. My children had complicated reactions to the divorce and everything that came with it. Michael, my oldest, had always been closest to Richard. He struggled to accept that his father was capable of what the court had found. For a while, he pulled away from me, unable to reconcile the dad he loved with the man described in testimony. But Michael is smart, and eventually, he started asking questions. He read the court documents. He talked to Sandra. He learned about patterns he had been too close to see. And slowly, painfully, he came to understand that loving someone doesn't mean excusing their behavior. Sarah and James accepted things more easily. They had seen more of Richard's coldness, experienced more of his dismissiveness. When the truth came out, they were sad but not shocked. My father was never really there, Sarah told me once. This just explains why. Richard tried to maintain relationships with the kids, but his heart wasn't in it. He was too busy trying to salvage his business, which was hemorrhaging clients and contracts in the wake of the scandal. Patterson Construction didn't collapse, but it diminished. The empire he'd built on women's contributions was finally being held accountable for that foundation's instability. Last I heard, Richard had sold a majority stake to a larger firm and taken a consulting role. He was still wealthy by any normal standard, but he was no longer the king of his domain, no longer the man who laughed at casseroles and expected the world to laugh with him. As for me, I discovered something unexpected in the aftermath of my divorce. I was good at things I'd never had a chance to explore. The financial skills I'd developed during those early years, the ones Richard had dismissed as bookkeeping, turned out to be valuable. I started consulting for other women, going through high-asset divorces, helping them understand the financial picture of their marriages, spotting hidden assets and irregularities. Priya and I formalized the arrangement. She handled the legal side. I handled the financial forensics. Together, we became known as the team you called when a wealthy man thought he could hide his money from his wife. 3 years after my divorce, we have a client list of over 100 women. We've recovered collectively over $200 million in hidden assets. We've helped women who thought they were powerless discover that they had more leverage than they knew. I think about that moment in the courtroom sometimes. Gerald Whitmore laughing at me, Richard smirking at the plaintiff's table. Everyone in that room underestimating the woman in the navy blue dress who had spent 2 decades being invisible. They stopped laughing when Sandra walked in. They stopped smirking when the hidden assets came out. They stopped underestimating me when the judge ruled in my favor on every single point. But the real victory wasn't the money or the ruling or the destruction of Richard's reputation. The real victory was the moment I realized that I had never been invisible. I had just been surrounded by people who refused to see me. Once I found people who could see, everything changed. My mother called me after the ruling. She was 82 by then, slowing down but still sharp as ever. "I know I told you not to marry him," she said, "but I'm glad you did." "Why?" "Because you proved something important. You proved that it's never too late to fight back. You proved that women don't have to accept what men decide to give us. You proved that casseroles and carpools and all the invisible work we do matters just as much as building empires." She paused. "I'm proud of you, Catherine. I've always been proud of you. But now I'm proud of you in a different way. You didn't just survive. You won." "I won," I agreed. "But I didn't do it alone. That's how women do it," she said. "Together, always together." If you've made it this far, thank you. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. I want you to do something now. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and leave me a comment telling me about a time when someone underestimated you. A time when you were laughed at or dismissed or made to feel invisible. And then tell me what you did about it. Because here's what I've learned. The people who laugh at us, who dismiss us, who treat us like we're nothing, they're wrong. They're always wrong. And the best revenge isn't anger or bitterness or plotting their destruction. The best revenge is proving them wrong so thoroughly, so completely, so undeniably, that they have to watch us succeed from the ruins of their own assumptions. Gerald Whitmore laughed at me in that courtroom. He thought I was nothing, a housewife with casseroles, beneath his notice and beneath his skill. He's not laughing anymore. And neither am I. Because laughter isn't really what victory feels like. Victory feels like peace, like finally being seen, like walking out of a courtroom with your head held high, knowing that you fought for yourself when no one else would. I built a new life from the wreckage of my old one. I found friendship with Sandra, who understood me better than anyone else could. I built a business that helps other women fight the same battles I fought. I raised children who grew up to be people I'm proud of. And every single day, I wake up in a house that I bought with my own settlement money, in a life that I built with my own hands. And I think about that moment when the courtroom doors opened and Sandra walked in. The moment when everything changed. The moment when the laughter stopped. More of my most gripping stories are already on your screen. Click one now. You're going to love what happens next. See you in the next one.